There is a prevalent idea in some herbalism communities that the green balls of Sweetgum can be taken and tinctured in order to make a DIY Tamiflu substitute. The reasoning behind this is that the infertile seeds of Sweetgum actually contain a relatively high amount of the chemical Shikimic acid, which is used in order to make Tamiflu. I was actually in the middle of making a video on how to do this, but I wanted to do my due diligence. So along with the help of my partner, we started to do some research, and what we found was very surprising. So Sweetgum is a well-known medicinal plant in its own right. In this video specifically, we are going to be trying to find the answer to the question, can you use Sweetgum as a viable Tamiflu alternative? And in order to do that, first we need to understand how Tamiflu actually works. Let's get started. As we know, Tamiflu, or more generically speaking, oseltamivir, is effective against both influenza A and B viruses in a specific way as what's known as a neuraminidase inhibitor. It sounds way more complicated than it actually is. In order to understand how a neuraminidase inhibitor works, we need to understand the neuraminidase enzyme and how the influenza virus uses it in viral replication in our bodies. So first what happens is that the virus enters one of our cells and hijacks it in order to produce more viruses. Once it has, those new viruses need to leave the cell, but as they do, they get stuck on the outside of our cell. This is where the virus uses the neuraminidase enzyme to break that connection to free itself to go on and infect other of our cells. This is also, of course, where the neuraminidase inhibitor comes in. It stops the enzyme from being able to break that connection, which effectively leaves the virus stuck on the outside of the cell, which means it can't go on to infect other cells, effectively reducing the virus's ability to replicate in our bodies. If you'd like to see a really awesome animation of how this whole process works, check this video out. It'll be linked in the description below. So now we know how Tamiflu works, but what is it about Tamiflu that makes it act as a neuraminidase inhibitor? My partner is going to answer that question for us right now.
To answer that question, we are going to turn to one of the core principles of molecular pharmacology, and that is that form determines function. It simply says that the structure of something tells us a lot about what it does and what it can be used for. Think about a wheel. It's circular, and it needs to be in order to maintain its function and identity. If it wasn't circular, we wouldn't call it a wheel. Chemicals aren't that different. And even the slightest change in chemical structure can dramatically affect what that chemical does in our bodies. Here, we can see the chemical skeleton of Tamiflu interacting with the neuraminidase enzyme, shown here in gray. We can see that the structure of the chemical is contouring to the cavity of the enzyme, and it is the very specific structure of Tamiflu that allows it to make unique interactions with the enzyme and thus inhibit viral release. Now, with that principle in mind, let's turn back to Shikimic acid and look at it side by side with Tamiflu. Clearly, we can see that there are a ton of structural differences between these two chemicals. And if you're thinking that these differences mean that they also have different functions, then you're right. Shikimic acid's structure does not allow for the same interactions with the neuraminidase enzyme as Tamiflu does. And for this reason, we can conclude that Shikimic acid does not work the same way or similarly to Tamiflu in the human body.
But maybe there's something going on in the interaction between Shikimic acid and ethanol that's getting us somewhere close. In order to understand that better, we really need to take a look at how Tamiflu is synthesized from Shikimic acid. Let's take a look at this diagram, which summarizes one of the ways in which this synthesis occurs. Right off the bat, we can see there are a lot of steps, and each one of them is incredibly deliberate. This whole process is highly synthetic. So if all that we're doing is making an alcohol extraction of Shikimic acid, we really aren't getting anywhere close. So if any of that was unclear, I find these two metaphors really helpful in understanding the relationship between Shikimic acid and Tamiflu. Let's start with the relationship between lettuce and a salad. So lettuce we would call the main ingredient of the salad, right? We take a bowl, we put lettuce in, we add in a vinaigrette, tomatoes, cucumbers, roasted almonds, whatever we need to make it taste even better. And if we were to take the lettuce out of the salad, it would still retain the properties of lettuce. Of course, in the salad it's better, but alone it still works relatively the same. The function is retained. This is how many people believe that shikimic acid works in relation to Tamiflu, but it is absolutely not correct. Instead, let's think more about the relationship between the frame of a car and the car itself. So if we were to look at a car and then look at the frame, we might see that, yeah, we can understand that that car came from that frame. However, the function is completely different. If we take a frame alone, it's not going to work at all like a car. It won't drive us anywhere. It requires the engine, the transmission, the wheels, and every other part in order to work. And alone, it doesn't work like a car in any way, shape, or form. That is the correct way to think about the relationship between shikimic acid and Tamiflu.
So, given all of that, do we now have enough information to answer our initial question?
Which is, can we use Sweetgum as a viable alternative to Tamiflu?
No, actually, we can't answer that question quite yet.
There are some things that we know and others that we need to explore a little further. Here's what we do know. Shikimic acid definitely doesn't work anything like Tamiflu. So the whole idea that you can extract shikimic acid from the infertile seeds of Sweetgum to get something that's going to work kind of like Tamiflu, that is completely untrue. We are calling that myth officially debunked. However, there are some things that we need to explore a little further.
For example, we found one article that showed the potential neuraminidase inhibitory activity of the liquid extract of Chinese Sweetgum. But to fully understand the implications of this article, we really need to examine it in a much broader context.
So in part 2, we are also going to be looking at the historical and ethnobotanical perspective of Sweetgum to get a more complete picture of its qualities as a medicinal plant.
In the meantime, take a look at this video's companion article.
There were some extra details that we didn't get to explore completely in the video that are all addressed in the article.
We really hope that you enjoyed this video. We put a lot of hours and energy into its research and production.
If there's anything that you think is an urban myth that you would like for us to explore, then please let us know in the comments below.
Thanks so much for watching.
And we will see you in part 2.